Good evening. Tonight we turn our attention to a subject that sits at the crossroads of law, politics, and the very fabric of American democracy. We're examining a law that has shaped the nation's response to crisis for over 2 centuries, the Insurrection Act. This powerful statute, often shrouded in controversy, grants the president extraordinary authority in times of domestic unrest. On October 6, 2025, President Donald Trump reignited a fierce national debate by suggesting he might invoke this rarely used law, thrusting it back into the public spotlight and raising urgent questions about presidential power. The Insurrection Act, first enacted in 1807, gives the president the ability to deploy the U.S. military on American soil to enforce federal law, restore order, or suppress civil disorder, insurrection, and rebellion. It's a tool designed for moments of national emergency, but its use is always fraught with controversy. President Trump's recent comments come amid a period of heightened political tension, following a federal court's decision to block his attempt to send the National Guard into Portland, Oregon, a city that has become a flashpoint for protests and unrest. In response to this legal setback, Trump floated the idea of invoking the Insurrection Act as an alternative, dramatically raising the stakes by considering the deployment of active-duty military forces in American cities. This move would represent a significant escalation in the federal government's response to domestic unrest. This isn't the first time Trump has referenced the Insurrection Act. Throughout his campaign and presidency, he has repeatedly promised a tough, uncompromising stance on civil unrest, appealing to supporters who see him as a defender of law and order. The ongoing situation in Portland has made the conversation about the Insurrection Act more urgent and real than ever before. The city's nightly clashes between demonstrators and law enforcement have become a symbol of the nation's deep divisions. The potential use of the Insurrection Act would mark a dramatic and historic moment in American democracy, forcing the nation to confront difficult questions about the balance between maintaining order and protecting civil liberties. Legal scholars, politicians, and citizens alike are now debating the implications of such a move. In the coming minutes, we'll break down what the Insurrection Act is, explore its origins and past uses, and consider what its invocation could mean for the country today. We'll look at the legal, political, and social ramifications of this extraordinary presidential power. As we stand at a pivotal moment in 2025, understanding this law and its potential impact is more important than ever. Let's dive in and explore the stakes together. What is the Insurrection Act? This law, rooted in the early days of the United States, is one of the most powerful and controversial tools available to the president. Simply put, it lets the president deploy federal troops inside the U.S. during extreme crises, like widespread violence, rebellion, or when local authorities can't restore order. Normally, the Posse Comitatus Act forbids the military from acting as domestic police, keeping a clear line between civilian law enforcement and the armed forces. The Insurrection Act is the exception, meant for situations like rebellion, insurrection, or when state authorities lose control and public safety is at risk. The president alone decides when such a crisis exists, and can act even if state leaders disagree or refuse to request help. He can federalize a state's National Guard, taking command away from the governor and placing it under federal control. Or, the president can send in active duty troops, even without a governor's request, if the situation is deemed urgent enough. The law's broad language gives the president sweeping discretion, with few checks on this extraordinary power. This is why its use is so controversial. What's a protest to some may be an insurrection to others, and the line between the two can be blurry. The act is a last resort tool, temporarily blurring the line between military and civilian policing and raising questions about civil liberties and government overreach. Invoking it brings the full force of the U.S. military to bear on domestic problems, sometimes changing the course of events in dramatic ways. It's a rare, weighty decision, one that's shaped American history in moments of crisis, from the Civil War to the Civil Rights era and beyond. Understanding this power is key to grasping today's debate, as Americans continue to wrestle with the balance between security and freedom in times of unrest. The Insurrection Act has played a pivotal role in shaping American history for more than 2 centuries, standing as one of the most consequential laws in the nation's legal framework. Its story is woven into the fabric of the United States, surfacing in moments of crisis and transformation. Signed into law by President Thomas Jefferson in 1807, the Insurrection Act was crafted to give the president authority to deploy military forces within the country's borders. Its original purpose was to help the federal government suppress insurrections, quell domestic violence, and enforce federal law when local authorities could not or would not act. Over the decades, presidents have invoked the act in a variety of circumstances, from early conflicts with Native American tribes, to labor strikes, to the turbulent years of the civil rights movement. Each invocation reflected the unique challenges of its era and the evolving relationship between federal and state power. In 1957, President Dwight D. Eisenhower famously used the Insurrection Act to send federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas. This decisive action ensured the desegregation of Central High School, protecting the rights of the Little Rock Nine against violent opposition and defiant state officials. Just a few years later, in 1962, President John F. Kennedy invoked the act to enforce a federal court order and integrate the University of Mississippi. Federal troops escorted James Meredith, the university's first black student, onto campus amid riots and resistance. These historic moments highlight the act's extraordinary power to enforce justice and uphold constitutional rights, especially when states have resisted federal mandates. The Insurrection Act has often been a last resort, called upon when the nation's core values were at stake. In 1992, President George H.W. Bush responded to the Los Angeles riots by sending federal troops at the request of California's governor. The city was gripped by violence and unrest after the Rodney King verdict, and the act was used to restore order and protect lives. Each use of the Insurrection Act has come during moments of national crisis, whether to restore public order, protect civil rights, or respond to widespread violence. The act's deployment is always a signal that the nation is facing extraordinary circumstances. The legacy of the Insurrection Act is complex and often controversial. It has been a tool for both justice and force, sometimes protecting the vulnerable, other times raising questions about the limits of presidential power and the role of the military in civilian life. Its rare invocation underscores the gravity of the decision. Presidents have often hesitated before using it, aware that calling in the military can have profound consequences for democracy and civil liberties. Today, as the nation faces new challenges and divisions, the possibility of invoking the Insurrection Act again signals a country at a crossroads, debating the balance between order and freedom, unity and dissent. The act's long and sometimes turbulent history is a powerful reminder that presidential power in times of crisis can shape the nation's future for generations to come. Now, as debates over its use return to the national spotlight, the Insurrection Act remains a symbol of both the strength and the fragility of American democracy. Why is the Insurrection Act back in the news? Look to Portland, Oregon. For months, the city has seen intense protests and clashes, with the White House calling it a city out of control. Trump's administration argues local leaders have failed, and federal intervention is needed to restore order. Portland's mayor and Oregon's governor disagree, saying most protests are peaceful, and federal involvement only escalates tensions. This standoff over Portland is the flashpoint for a national debate on law, order, and presidential power. The Trump administration's plan to send the National Guard to Portland was blocked by a federal judge on October 5, 2025. The court ruled the president lacked authority to deploy troops without a governor's request. Civil liberties groups and local officials argued the legal threshold hadn't been met. In response, the White House called the legal challenge a legal insurrection and accused the courts of overstepping. Trump then suggested he might invoke the Insurrection Act if blocked further, signaling a willingness to bypass both courts and state officials. This escalates the conflict from a local policing issue to a constitutional showdown. The president's stance: he alone can decide when to restore order, regardless of opposition. The nation now faces a test of the limits of presidential authority. Supporters of President Trump see the Insurrection Act as a necessary tool to restore order. They argue that cities like Portland are in chaos, with local leaders unable or unwilling to act. For them, the federal government has a duty to protect citizens and property when states fail. They view the president's tough rhetoric as a promise to end lawlessness and defend the nation. Economic and social costs of unrest are cited as reasons for decisive action. Many trust Trump's judgment to determine when military intervention is needed. For these supporters, invoking the Insurrection Act is not tyranny, it's leadership. They believe restoring order is the government's first responsibility. Critics warn that using the Insurrection Act risks dangerous executive overreach. They argue deploying the military against Americans should be a last resort, not a response to civil unrest. Civil liberties groups and legal scholars stress the importance of keeping military and police roles separate. They fear this move could set a precedent for silencing dissent and eroding democracy. Critics accuse the president of exaggerating unrest for political gain and undermining local authority. For them, the act's use in this context threatens the balance of power and fundamental rights. Some confuse the Insurrection Act with martial law, but they're not the same. Invoking the Insurrection Act means the military supports civilian authorities. Civilian government and courts remain in charge. Martial law, by contrast, suspends civilian rule entirely, putting the military in control and suspending constitutional rights. The Supreme Court has ruled martial law is only for the most extreme crises, like invasion or total collapse of civil order. President Trump's proposal, while serious, does not suspend the Constitution or replace local government. The Insurrection Act allows military support to enforce existing laws, not a military takeover. Understanding this distinction is crucial to the current debate. The controversy is about presidential power, not martial law. The debate over the Insurrection Act brings America to a crossroads. Supporters see it as a necessary step to restore order. Critics fear it's a dangerous overreach. The law's rare use in history underscores the gravity of the moment. The president's willingness to invoke it has deepened national divisions and raised questions about the limits of executive power. As of now, Trump has not invoked the act, but the threat alone has sparked intense debate. What happens next in Portland? The courts and the White House will shape the nation's future. The conflict is about more than one city. It's about the balance between order and liberty. The nation watches and waits.